The bitter winds of Shadow Creek Valley howled through the naked branches as three notorious outlaws approached the solitary homestead. Their intentions were as dark as the storm-laden clouds gathering overhead. They couldn't have known that. The elderly woman tending her herb garden, her ash-white hair dancing in the frozen breeze, was once known as Silent Eleanor Reed, the shadow assassin whose name was whispered in fear from Texas to Dakota Territory, with more confirmed kills than any marshal in 6 states. Their mistake would be their last. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The harsh winter of 1875 had transformed Shadow Creek Valley into a canvas of white desolation. Eleanor Matthews stood in her garden, weathered hands moving methodically among the frost-covered herbs. To any observer, she appeared nothing more than another hardy frontier widow, the silver threading through her dark hair and wire-rimmed spectacles marking her as someone who had weathered life's storms with quiet dignity. The 3 riders approaching her homestead moved with the practiced confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Leading them was Marcus Thorne, a hulking figure whose face bore the marks of smallpox, leaving him with a perpetually menacing expression. His reputation for cruelty had spread across 3 territories, each tale more horrifying than the last. Beside him rode his younger brother Lucas, a man whose elegant appearance and fine clothes belied the cold calculation in his eyes. His silver-plated colt gleamed in the winter light, its handle adorned with intricate carvings that had become his calling card, left behind at scenes of unspeakable violence. The 3rd rider, Jack Swift-Hand Cooper, was barely 25, but his boyish features masked a killer's instinct honed in the blood-soaked streets of St. Louis. His quick draw had already left 15 men dead in the past year alone. Eleanor's hands never paused in their work as she tracked their approach in the reflection of her cabin's frosted windows. Her seemingly frail fingers, now gently separating dried sage leaves, had once moved faster than the eye could follow. The simple garden shears in her grasp had replaced the custom-made Remington that had earned her the nickname Silent, a reference not to any vow of silence, but to the way her targets never lived long enough to make a sound. Inside the cabin, young Rebecca Wilson watched through a gap in the curtains, her fingers clutching the locket her mother had given her before succumbing to fever 2 winters ago. The 16-year-old knew Mrs. Matthews's true identity, or at least pieces of it, that she'd gathered during the long evenings when the widow had taught her to read by lamplight. She'd seen the mysterious mark etched into the grip of the Remington that Mrs. Matthews kept hidden beneath the floorboards, a coiled serpent surrounding a dagger, known only to members of an elite group of government-sanctioned eliminators, who had operated in secret during the darkest days of the Civil War. The homestead's apparent isolation had drawn the Thorne gang like vultures to carrion, but its location had been carefully chosen. Eleanor had selected this property for its tactical advantages, spending months preparing for the inevitable day when her violent past would catch up with her. Every fence post had been positioned to provide cover, every window reinforced behind its innocent appearance, every possible angle of attack considered and countered. The Thorne brothers were infamous throughout the Dakota Territory for targeting isolated homesteads, particularly those owned by women living alone. They had left a trail of burned-out farms and shattered lives across 4 states, their victims' suffering feeding their twisted sense of power. But they had no way of knowing they had just walked into the carefully laid trap of a legend they believed had died years ago in a blazing gunfight in Kansas City. As Marcus Thorne pushed open her garden gate, his scarred face twisted into what he probably thought was a charming smile. Eleanor Matthews felt the familiar tension of an approaching storm, one that had nothing to do with the dark clouds gathering overhead. To understand the full weight of what was about to unfold in Shadow Creek Valley, we need to return to a time when Eleanor Reed's name was whispered in smoke-filled saloons with equal measures of awe and terror, a time before she had traded her assassin's garb for a widow's weeds, before she had chosen this quiet valley as the place to bury both her past and the man whose love had transformed her from an agent of death into a protector of the innocent. The year was 1862, and the nation was being torn apart by civil war. While armies clashed in the east, the Western Territories descended into a different kind of chaos. In this lawless frontier, a young woman named Eleanor Reed was about to begin her transformation from a Boston socialite into the most feared operative in the West. The daughter of a prominent Massachusetts judge, Eleanor had been raised in privilege, educated in the finest schools. But it was the arrival of a mysterious government agent in the spring of 1862 that would forever alter her destiny. William Drake, a former Pinkerton detective turned shadow operative, recognized something special in the way the young woman carried herself. A natural talent for becoming invisible in plain sight. Drake belonged to a clandestine organization known as the Serpent's Hand, an elite group of government assassins operating outside traditional law enforcement. Their distinctive mark, a coiled serpent around a dagger, was known only to a select few. With the nation divided by war, the Serpent's Hand worked to eliminate those who would exploit the chaos for their own gain. "Your gift isn't in violence," Drake had told her that first day, after watching her move through a crowded Boston social gathering without a single person remembering her presence. "It's in making people see exactly what they expect to see. Nothing more, nothing less." Eleanor's training under Drake was methodical and relentless. Dawn would find them practicing the art of blending into any crowd. Afternoons were spent learning to read the subtle tells that revealed a target's intentions, and evenings were devoted to mastering the swift, silent kills that would become her trademark. The fastest gun meant nothing, Drake would say, if your target saw you coming. But their peaceful training was shattered one autumn evening when Confederate sympathizers attacked her father's house, seeking revenge for his pro-Union rulings. Eleanor's father, standing firm against their demands for classified military documents, took a bullet to the chest. As he fell, Eleanor's world narrowed to the weight of the knife Drake had given her for practice and the distance between her and her father's. Killers. What happened next would become the stuff of whispered legend. 4 attackers fell before they even knew she was there, their deaths as silent as falling snow. 3 more made it to their horses, only to drop from wounds they never saw coming. The last attacker, a young man barely older than Eleanor, surrendered to the shadows themselves, never even glimpsing the woman who had eliminated his companions. Drake found her later that night, cleaning her father's blood from the parlor floor. "You're ready," was all he said, presenting her with a custom Remington revolver bearing the coiled serpent. That night, Eleanor Reed joined the ranks of the Serpent's Hand, beginning a career that would make her name synonymous with swift, silent justice. Over the next decade, as the nation struggled to heal its Civil War wounds, Eleanor's reputation grew. She operated throughout the Western Territories, appearing where she was needed most, then vanishing like morning mist. Unlike many gunfighters who sought glory or notoriety, Eleanor worked in absolute silence. Her targets often found days later, with no trace of their killer. The streak of white that would later dominate her hair began the night she faced down the notorious Maxwell gang in Colorado. Surrounded in a mountain pass, outnumbered 12-1, she emerged at dawn, the only one breathing, but the stress of the night had left its mark, a streak of silver at her temple that would gradually spread over the years. Some claimed she was a ghost, blessed with supernatural abilities that defied explanation. Others whispered she was death's own bride, choosing her targets with the cold precision of the Reaper himself. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between. She was simply someone who had transformed personal tragedy into lethal purpose, honing her natural talents into something extraordinary. But it was her encounter with James Matthews, a quiet bookkeeper in Kansas City, that would ultimately change everything. James saw past the carefully constructed facade to the woman beneath, offering her something she'd never dared hope for: a chance at a normal life. Their courtship was as unconventional as it was genuine, conducted between her assignments for the Serpent's Hand and his management of the city's most prestigious bank. When they married in 1872, Eleanor believed she had finally found a way to leave her violent past behind. The Serpent's Hand gave their blessing, understanding that even their most effective operative deserved a chance at happiness. James and Eleanor relocated to Shadow Creek Valley, Dakota Territory, where no one knew of silent Eleanor Reed or her legendary exploits. For 3 years, they lived a quiet life, their homestead becoming a place of peace rather than violence. James taught Eleanor about ledgers and banking, while she gradually adapted to being known simply as Mrs. Matthews, the banker's wife. But fate had other plans, and one bitter winter morning, James rode out to help a neighboring farm with their accounts and never returned. His body was found frozen in the snow, 2 neat bullet holes in his chest, the signature of an assassin. Eleanor maintained her cover as the grieving widow, but inside, silent Eleanor Reed awakened once more. She began preparing, converting her homestead into an invisible fortress while maintaining its innocent appearance. She knew that sooner or later, the violence she had left behind would find her again. Looking at the Thorne brothers approaching her gate, she realized that day had finally arrived. Now, as the winter wind howled across Shadow Creek Valley, Eleanor Matthews stood ready to remind the world why silent Eleanor Reed's name had once made even the most hardened killers check their shadows twice. The harsh Dakota winter had transformed Shadow Creek Valley into a landscape of lethal beauty. Pristine white snow against dark timber, peaceful homesteads against the looming threat of violence. Eleanor Matthews stood motionless in her garden, her hands still wrapped around dried herbs as she watched the Thorne brothers approach. 2 years of careful preparation were about to be tested. Inside the cabin, young Rebecca Wilson had already moved silently toward the root cellar, just as they'd rehearsed countless times. The girl's mother had been one of James Matthews's most valued clients, and after her death from fever, Eleanor had taken Rebecca under her wing. What started as reading lessons had gradually evolved into something more: careful instruction in observation, strategy, and survival. Always watch their eyes, Eleanor had told Rebecca during their lessons. A man's mouth might lie, but his eyes will betray his intentions every time. Now, studying Marcus Thorne's approaching figure, Eleanor saw the predatory gleam that had sealed the fate of so many other homesteaders. His pock-scarred face twisted into what he probably thought was a charming smile, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The homestead Eleanor had created was a masterpiece of deception. Every seemingly decorative feature served a tactical purpose. The rose trellises along the front porch concealed reinforced firing positions. The newly installed gutters were angled to provide perfect sightlines. Even the garden beds were positioned to force visitors along a specific path, one that would leave them exposed if violence erupted. Lucas Thorne's silver-plated colt caught the winter light as he shifted in his saddle. Eleanor noted how he kept his left hand closer to his gun, despite being right-handed, a tell that had cost many men their lives when they expected his draw to come from the wrong side. Behind him, young Jack Cooper tried to project confidence, but his constant adjustments to his gun belt betrayed his nervousness. As they drew closer, Eleanor could feel the weight of the moment building, like pressure before a storm. The wind that had been howling all morning suddenly died, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the crunch of snow under the outlaw's boots. A lone raven watched from a nearby pine tree, as if sensing the approaching violence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would remind the world why some legends never truly die. They just wait in the shadows, watching and preparing for the moment when justice demands their return. "Fine day for a visit, ma'am," Marcus Thorne called out, his voice carrying the forced politeness of a predator playing with its prey. "Hope we're not interrupting your gardening." The gold tooth in his smile gleamed dully in the winter light. Eleanor straightened slowly, playing the role of the unsuspecting widow to perfection. "Not at all," she replied, her voice carrying the slight tremor expected of an aging woman in the cold, though her hands, still holding the herbs, remained visible and non-threatening. Around the homestead, nature itself seemed to hold its breath. The winter wind that had been howling all morning suddenly died, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the crunch of snow under the outlaw's boots. "Don't you worry about hospitality, Mrs. Matthews," Lucas Thorne drawled, swinging down from his horse. "We'll help ourselves to whatever we need." His brother's laugh carried a cruel edge that had heralded death for countless victims across 4 territories. Eleanor's mind catalogued every detail with the precision that had once made her legendary. Marcus Thorne stood with his weight slightly forward, an old knife wound in his thigh, affecting his balance. Lucas's fancy colt was spotlessly clean, suggesting form over function. Young Cooper's nervous energy would make him quick, but likely inaccurate. Inside the cabin, Rebecca peered through a carefully drilled hole in the root cellar's ceiling. She had her own role to play in what was coming, tasks that Eleanor had drilled into her with the same patience she'd shown teaching her to read. "Sometimes survival isn't about being the fastest or strongest," Eleanor had told her. "It's about being the smartest and most prepared." The Thorne brothers had chosen her homestead for the same reasons they'd selected all their victims: isolated location, apparent vulnerability, and the assumption that a widow living alone would be easy prey. They had no way of knowing that every feature they saw as a weakness had been carefully crafted to appear that way. "We've been riding hard," Marcus said, moving closer to the garden gate. "Thought we might rest our horses here for a spell." His hand rested casually near his holster, a gesture that had preceded violence countless times before. "Maybe sample some of that famous Dakota hospitality we've heard so much about." Eleanor's fingers moved almost imperceptibly, checking the position of her concealed Remington through the folds of her dress. The weight of the weapon was comforting, like greeting an old friend. In her mind, she could feel the serpent mark on its grip, warming to her touch, as if awakening from a long slumber. "Hospitality is sacred in these parts," she replied, her voice carrying an edge that none of them yet recognized. "Though I seem to recall it needs to be freely offered, not taken by force." The words hung in the frozen air like smoke from a gun barrel. For a fraction of a second, surprise flickered across Marcus Thorne's scarred face. It was the same look Eleanor had seen countless times before, the moment when a predator suddenly realized it might have become prey. Behind him, Lucas's hand drifted closer to his elaborately decorated colt, while young Cooper shifted uneasily, sensing something wasn't quite right. The winter sun emerged briefly from behind the clouds, catching the silver in Eleanor's hair and making it gleam like the barrel of a well-polished gun. In that moment, as the Thorne brothers stood unwittingly on the threshold of their own reckoning, the legend of silent Eleanor Reed prepared to resurface in a storm of lead and justice. Marcus Thorne's pox-marked face darkened at Eleanor's subtle defiance, the practiced smile slipping to reveal something far more dangerous beneath. He took another step toward the garden gate, his boots leaving deep marks in the pristine snow. "Ma'am," he drawled, the false politeness now carrying a lethal edge, "I don't think you understand your situation here." Inside the cabin, Rebecca Wilson's hand tightened around the signal mirror she held, another of Eleanor's careful preparations. The young girl's heart raced, but her hands remained steady. Eleanor had taught her that fear was natural, but control was essential. Through the root cellar's cleverly disguised viewing hole, she could see everything unfolding in the yard above. Her role was crucial. Eleanor had spent months teaching her exactly what to do when this moment came. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the weight of countless silent eliminations. She carefully set her gardening tools aside, each movement measured and deliberate. 3 men riding hard from the east, avoiding the main trails. Heavy saddlebags, probably carrying stolen goods. Enough weapons between you to start a small war. Lucas Thorne's hand moved closer to his silver-plated colt, his eyes narrowing at the widow's unexpected observation. "You've got keen eyes for an old woman," he said, the threat in his voice barely concealed. Behind him, young Cooper shifted nervously, his earlier bravado cracking under the strange tension that had begun to fill the air. "You learn to notice things living alone out here," Eleanor continued, her fingers brushing against her concealed Remington through her skirts. "Like how a man favors his right leg when he's nursing an old knife wound, or how decorated pistols often belong to men more interested in show than substance." Marcus Thorne's face contorted with rage, the pox scars standing out white against his flush skin. "Enough games," he snarled, his hand dropping to his holster. "This is how it's going. To work. You're going to invite us inside, show us every hiding place where you've stashed anything valuable. And maybe, just maybe, we'll leave you with enough supplies to survive the winter." The threat hung in the frozen air like icicles, sharp, deadly, and ready to fall, but Eleanor Matthews stood unmoved, her silver-streaked hair catching the winter light. 2 years of maintaining her cover, of playing the role of the humble widow, had prepared her for this moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried echoes of silent Eleanor Reed that made even Marcus Thorne pause. "Let me tell you how this is actually going to work," she said, her tone carrying the same finality that had once made her legend. "You're going to turn around, mount those horses you probably stole, and ride out of my valley. Because if you don't, I promise you won't leave here the same way you came in." Young Cooper actually took a step back, something in the widow's voice triggering deep survival instincts. But Marcus Thorne had built his reputation on violence, and he wasn't about to be threatened by a woman he saw as nothing more than another easy target. "Get her," he commanded, drawing his pistol with the speed that had ended many lives. But Eleanor Matthews was already moving, her supposedly frail body displaying the liquid grace that had once made silent Eleanor Reed the most feared assassin in 6 territories. The Remington seemed to materialize in her hand, its serpent mark, catching the winter sun as she drew and fired in one fluid motion. Marcus Thorne's gun went spinning into a snowbank along with 3 fingers from his shooting hand. His howl of pain and rage echoed across the valley as Lucas Thorne and young Cooper struggled to process what they had just witnessed. "That was your first and only warning shot," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying the same steady calm that had once made hardened killers reconsider their life choices. The Remington remained level, unwavering despite the bitter cold. "The next one won't be nearly as merciful." Lucas Thorne recovered first, his fancy colt clearing leather with practiced speed, but Eleanor had already disappeared behind one of her strategically placed rose trellises. The seemingly decorative structure now served its true purpose as cover. His shot splintered wood where she had been standing moments before. Inside the root cellar, Rebecca Wilson remembered her instructions as the first shots rang out. She used the signal mirror to flash a predetermined pattern toward the distant hillside, where Eleanor had arranged another surprise for the Thorne gang. The girl's hands remained steady, just as they had during their secret practice sessions. Young Cooper, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, tried to drag Marcus toward the minimal cover offered by their horses. The older man's curses mixed with the sound of Lucas's continued firing, the elaborate engravings on his Colt doing nothing to improve his accuracy against a target that seemed to move like smoke. "Last chance," Eleanor's voice carried across the yard, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Another trick she'd learned during her days with the Serpent's Hand. "Ride out now, or this becomes the kind of story that will haunt saloons for years to come." But the Thorne brothers hadn't built their bloody reputation by backing down. Marcus, clutching his maimed hand to his chest, snarled orders to his companions. They began spreading out, trying to flank the positions where they thought the widow might be hiding. Their confidence was shaken, but not yet broken. They didn't notice how Eleanor's carefully planned garden paths were herding them exactly where she wanted them. Didn't see how Rebecca's signal mirror had alerted watchers on the distant ridge. Didn't realize that everything from the placement of the woodpile to the angle of the porch steps had been arranged for this very moment. The winter wind picked up again, carrying with it the promise of violence as old as the West itself. Silent. Eleanor Reed was about to remind these men why her name had once made even the bravest killers think twice about trusting their shadows. The winter landscape of Shadow Creek Valley had transformed into a deadly chessboard, with Eleanor Matthews controlling every move. Lucas Thorne's fancy colt continued to bark uselessly at shadows, while Marcus nursed his maimed hand behind their horses, his face twisted into a mask of pain and fury. Young Cooper kept glancing toward the valley's entrance, clearly wrestling. "With the instinct to flee, 8 shots, Lucas," Eleanor's voice carried across the yard, still seemingly coming from multiple directions. "That decorative colt only holds 6 each. By my count, you've wasted 14 already." The calculation was precise, deliberate, another lesson from her days with the Serpent's Hand. Make them doubt, make them count, make them fear. Inside the cabin, Rebecca Wilson maintained her position at the observation point, watching the scene unfold through carefully placed spy holes. Eleanor had trained her for this, taught her to be more than just a lookout. "Knowledge wins battles before they're fought," she told the girl during their long evening lessons. Now Rebecca's keen eyes tracked every movement, noting details, just as she'd been taught. "Whoever you are," Marcus Thorne shouted, his voice roaring with rage and pain, "you have no idea what you've started. We've got friends, powerful friends. They'll burn this whole valley to find you." Blood dripped from his mangled hand, staining the pristine snow crimson. Eleanor's laugh echoed off the surrounding hills, carrying the edge that had once made her legend. "Friends? You mean the Blackwood gang camped 3 miles north? Or maybe the 2 scouts you left watching the valley entrance?" She let the words sink in before continuing. "They won't be joining us." This revelation sent a visible shock through the Thorne brothers. Lucas's next shot went wild, betraying his shaken confidence. Young Cooper's face went pale. He'd been counting on that backup, not knowing that Eleanor had spent the past week systematically neutralizing every potential ally the Thorne gang had in the territory. "See, that's the trouble with men like you," Eleanor continued, using her voice to disguise her movement between pre-planned positions. "You think because something looks vulnerable, it must be. Never occurs to you that someone might be counting on that assumption." The garden paths Eleanor had so carefully maintained throughout the winter now proved their worth. While they appeared to be simple walkways between her herb beds, they had been meticulously designed to channel movement. Every time the Thorne gang tried to advance, they found themselves naturally flowing into killing zones covered by multiple angles. Rebecca's signal mirror flashed again, this time catching Lucas's eye and momentarily blinding him. It was no accident. Eleanor had calculated the sun's position for this time of day, another layer in her intricate trap. The brief distraction was all she needed to change positions again, moving like smoke between her carefully prepared fighting positions. "You know what I've noticed about famous outlaws?" Eleanor's voice carried a teacher's tone now, as if sharing wisdom with particularly slow students. "They spend so much time working on their reputation, they forget about everything else. Like how to fight when you're cold or tired or bleeding." As if to emphasize her point, a shot rang out. Lucas Thorne screamed as his left boot exploded, the bullet destroying his fancy spur without breaking skin, a warning shot of surgical precision, delivered with the casual ease of someone who could have easily aimed higher. "That's 2 warnings now," Eleanor announced, her voice hardening. "More than I usually give, but I made a promise once to a good man that I'd try mercy before violence." The mention of James brought a familiar ache to her chest, but her aim remained steady. Young Cooper finally broke, making a dash for his horse, but Eleanor had anticipated this too. A shot rang out, and his gun belt fell to the snow, the buckle shattered. "Going somewhere, boy?" Her voice carried almost maternal disappointment. "Sit down before you get hurt." Inside the cabin, Rebecca watched in fascination as Eleanor's careful preparations continued to unfold. Every feature of the homestead that had seemed innocent now revealed its tactical purpose. The woodpile Cooper tried to use as cover was strategically stacked to leave gaps for shots while appearing solid. The rain barrel by the porch had been positioned to reflect movement from blind spots. Marcus Thorne, despite his injury, proved why he'd survived so long in his brutal profession. "She can't be everywhere," he growled to his brother. "Rush her together, different directions. She's just one old woman." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. One old woman. Eleanor's laugh carried genuine amusement now. "Let me explain something about age, Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone carrying the same finality that had once made her legend. "You don't live long in this profession by being predictable." As if to prove her point, another shot rang out. The decorative wind chimes by the porch exploded, showering Lucas with fragments of metal and forcing him to dive for cover. "You see, while you boys were building your reputation for cruelty, I was learning something far more valuable." Eleanor's voice hardened again. "I learned that survival isn't about being the fastest draw or the deadliest shot. It's about being smarter than what's trying to kill you." The winter wind carried the metallic scent of blood and gun smoke across the valley. Eleanor Matthews, the quiet widow, had transformed her homestead into a deadly maze where every innocent feature concealed a lethal purpose. The Thorne brothers, who had terrorized the territory with impunity, were about to learn why silent Eleanor Reed's name had once made even the most hardened killers pray they never caught her attention. As the confrontation at the homestead intensified, memories of another winter day flashed through Eleanor's mind. It had been during her Serpent's Hand days, in a snow-covered Wyoming canyon, where she'd learned the most valuable lesson of her career from William Drake. The difference between a killer and a survivor, he'd told her, is that a killer thinks about the shot, while a survivor thinks about everything else. Now, watching the Thorne brothers struggle against her carefully laid trap, those words rang truer than ever. Marcus Thorne had managed to bind his bleeding hand with a bandana, his face a mask of hatred as he tried to coordinate with his brother. Lucas's expensive boots left bloody prints in the snow from his shattered spur, while young Cooper sat trembling against the woodpile, his empty gun belt a stark reminder of his powerlessness. "You know what's interesting about this valley?" Eleanor's voice carried across the yard, steady and conversational despite the tension. "The way the wind moves through it. Those gusts you hear, they're not random." On cue, a bitter blast of winter wind howled through the homestead, carrying stinging snow that forced the Thorne brothers to shield their eyes. Rebecca Wilson, still, at her observation post, watched in amazement as Eleanor used the moment to ghost between positions. Even knowing what to look for, the girl could barely track her mentor's movement. The widow had spent months teaching her about the valley's weather patterns, but only now did Rebecca understand the full tactical importance of those lessons. "James used to say I was fussy about where we built," Eleanor continued, her voice now coming from a completely different direction. "Couldn't understand why I insisted on this exact spot. Poor man never knew he'd married a woman who'd spent years studying how terrain affects a fight." The mention of her late husband brought a familiar ache to Eleanor's heart, but she pushed it aside. There would be time for grief later. Now she needed to maintain the psychological pressure that was slowly breaking down the Thorn gang's confidence. 38. She called out, making Marcus Thorn's head snap around, trying to locate her. "That's how many men made the mistake you're making right now, thinking they had the advantage of numbers, thinking age and appearance meant weakness." Another shot rang out, splitting a fence post inches from Lucas's head. Want to guess how many of them lived to learn from that mistake? Inside the cabin, Rebecca remembered the mysterious ledger she'd discovered while cleaning, the one Eleanor had quickly hidden away. Now she wondered if those pages contained the stories behind that number, the history of silent Eleanor Reed, before she became the widow Matthews. "You're lying," Lucas Thorne shouted, his composure cracking. "Ain't no woman ever took down that many men." But his voice carried the edge of doubt, the growing fear that they'd walked into something far more dangerous than an isolated homestead. Eleanor's laugh carried across the yard, sharp as the crack of a gun. "Your brother's already lost 3 fingers finding out how wrong you are. Care to test that theory further?" As if to emphasize her point, another shot rang out, this one destroying the heel of Lucas's already damaged boot. Young Cooper let out a strangled sound that might have been a prayer. "You wanted to know what I understand about my situation." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of decades of experience now. "I understand that every person you've terrorized, every homestead you've raided, every life you've destroyed, they all led you here, to this valley, to this day, to me." The winter sun broke through the clouds again, catching the silver in Eleanor's hair as she emerged from cover, her Remington steady in hands that had never lost their lethal skill. The serpent mark on its grip seemed to glow in the harsh light, a symbol of justice long delayed, but finally at hand. "Last chance, gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used in countless eliminations before, though truth be told, she wasn't sure they deserved even that much mercy. The Remington in her hand looked as natural as a garden tool had earlier, perhaps even more so. The Thorne brothers, who had built their reputation on preying on the seemingly helpless, were about to learn why silent Eleanor Reed's name had once been whispered as a prayer by the innocent and a curse by the wicked. The quiet widow of Shadow. Creek Valley was about to remind the world that sometimes the deadliest predators are the ones that learn to hide in plain sight. The Thorne brothers' world had shrunk to the confines of Eleanor Matthews' front yard, a space that had transformed from a simple homestead into a tactical nightmare. Marcus Thorne's blood continued to stain the snow crimson from his maimed hand, while Lucas's ruined boots crunched awkwardly with each movement. Young Cooper remained frozen by the woodpile, his empty gun belt a constant reminder of their miscalculation. "You know what makes a perfect shot?" Eleanor's voice carried across the yard, steady and almost educational in tone. "It's not about natural talent. It's not even about practice, though God knows I've put in my share." Another shot rang out, splitting a branch that Lucas had been trying to use for cover. "It's about patience, about knowing exactly when to pull the trigger." Rebecca Wilson watched from her observation post as Eleanor's carefully orchestrated plan continued to unfold. The girl had spent months learning the widow's lessons, but only now did she fully understand their depth. Each shot, each movement, each word was calculated to break down the outlaw's confidence and control. A sound from the ridge caught everyone's attention, the distant but unmistakable approach of riders. But before anyone could react to this new development, a figure emerged from the tree line that made Eleanor's breath catch for just a moment. Even through the swirling snow, she would know that silhouette anywhere. William Drake, her old mentor from the Serpent's Hand, rode into view. His appearance sent a visible shock through the Thorne brothers, but Eleanor's mind was already racing through the implications. Drake's presence changed everything. He wouldn't be here unless something bigger was at stake. Well, well, Drake's voice carried across the yard as cold as the driving snow. If it isn't my finest student. He moved with the deliberate grace of a seasoned predator, his long coat concealing what Eleanor knew would be a custom-made Lamat revolver. And the Thorne brothers, too. This is quite the reunion. Mary Wilson, watching from her observation post, saw something she'd never witnessed before. A flicker of genuine concern cross Eleanor's face. The girl remembered late-night conversations, fragments of stories about a mission gone wrong, about a debt of honor that remained unpaid. William Drake. Eleanor's voice remained steady, though there was a new edge to it. The reports of your retirement were greatly exaggerated, I see. Though I have to say, the years seem to have improved your timing. She shifted position, maintaining her tactical advantage despite the new threat. Marcus Thorne, still nursing his maimed hand, looked at the newcomer with a mixture of shock and hope. Drake? But they said the Pinkertons had... His voice trailed. Off as Drake raised a hand for silence, never taking his eyes off Eleanor's position. You want to know something interesting about retirement, Eleanor? Drake's voice carried the weight of years spent plotting something. It gives a person time to think, time to plan, time to learn everything there is to know about the woman who became their greatest success and their greatest failure. He took another step forward, seemingly unconcerned by the deadly accuracy she had already demonstrated. Eleanor's mind raced through the implications. Drake knew her methods, had taught her many of them himself during their time with the Serpent's Hand. More importantly, he knew about James, about what had really happened that winter day 2 years ago. The boys here thought they were just hitting another lonely homestead, Drake continued, gesturing to the Thorne brothers. But I've been watching you, Eleanor, watching you build this little fortress, watching you train that girl in there, watching you prepare for a day you knew would come. Rebecca's hand tightened on her signal mirror. Eleanor had never mentioned William Drake in their lessons, but the girl could sense the history between them, heavy as storm clouds and just as dangerous. You're still using the same tricks, Drake observed, taking another measured step forward. The multiple firing positions, the carefully planned paths, even that signal mirror the girl's holding. We used to use those in the hand, didn't we, Eleanor? Inside the cabin, Rebecca saw Eleanor move with liquid grace to a new position. But there was a tension in her movement that hadn't been there before. This wasn't part of the plan. This was something else entirely. You want to know what really happened when I left the hand? Drake's voice carried a cruel smile. How did I survive that last mission? I had help. The same kind of help that led me to James that day. The same kind that's been keeping me informed about your movements ever since. Eleanor's response was a shot that should have taken Drake's hat off. But he was already moving, displaying the same preternatural speed that had once made them both legends. You're slipping, Eleanor, he taunted. Time was, you wouldn't have missed that shot. The storm intensified, but now it seemed to work against Eleanor's carefully laid plans. Drake knew her tactics, knew how she used weather and terrain to her advantage. He'd been more than just another operative. He had been her mentor, her friend, before ambition and betrayal had turned him into something else entirely. Tell me, Eleanor, Drake called out, his voice carrying over the wind. Does the girl know the truth about James? About why he really died? About the choice you made that day? Each word was calculated to cut deeper than any bullet. Young Cooper, still by the woodpile, looked between Drake and the Thorne brothers in confusion. But Marcus and Lucas had begun to smile, understanding dawning in their eyes. Their seemingly hopeless situation had suddenly shifted with the arrival of the one person who knew all of silent Eleanor Reed's secrets. "You always were too clever for your own good, Eleanor," Drake continued, moving laterally to force her to adjust her position, always thinking 3 steps ahead. "But you forgot something important. You forgot that some ghosts don't stay buried, no matter how deep you put them." The winter wind carried the weight of unspoken history between them, of betrayals and choices that had led them all to this moment. Eleanor Matthews, the quiet widow of Shadow Creek Valley, found herself facing not just a dangerous opponent, but a man who knew exactly who she had been, and, more importantly, who she had become. The legend of silent Eleanor Reed was about to face its greatest test, not against superior numbers or faster guns, but against the one person who knew all her secrets, all her tactics, all her fears. The storm that had been her ally now seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this deadly reunion would end. "You remember Carson City?" Drake's voice carried across the yard, laden with memory. "That night, when we took down the Reynolds, a gang, you had everything planned out just like this, every angle covered, every escape route blocked." He moved with deliberate grace through the snow, each step calculated. "But you didn't expect Reynolds to have inside information then either." Eleanor's response was measured, careful. "As I recall, you were the only one who knew our plans that night, William. Just like you were the only one who knew about the St. Louis operation. Just like you were the only one who knew where James and I had settled." Through her observation post, Rebecca Wilson watched the subtle shift in dynamics. The confidence that had marked Eleanor's every move earlier now carried an edge of caution. The girl remembered fragments of late-night conversations, whispered stories about betrayal and loss that suddenly carried new weight. "You always did think you were the smartest one in the room, Eleanor," Drake continued, his hand hovering near his concealed LeMat. "Planning everything down to the smallest detail, but you forgot something important. You forgot that some of us were watching, learning, adapting." Inside the cabin, Rebecca noticed movement in the distance through the swirling snow. She could make out figures approaching, members of the community Eleanor had protected for the past 2 years. The signal mirror had done more than just blind. Lucas Thorne. It had called for help from people who owed the widow Matthews their lives. "I know about the tunnel system under the barn," Drake announced, making Eleanor's breath catch slightly. "The one you modified from the old mine shaft. Know about the reinforced wall in the root cellar, too. Even know about the cache of weapons you've got hidden in the false floor under your bed." He smiled coldly. "Been watching you build this fortress? For months, Eleanor, watching and waiting." Marcus Thorne, his maimed hand forgotten in the revelation of Drake's presence, had begun moving toward his former mentor's position. Lucas, too, seemed to draw strength from Drake's presence. Even young Cooper's fear had been replaced by a predatory anticipation. "Interesting thing about watching," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying an edge that made even Drake pause. "Sometimes you see exactly what someone wants you to see." As if on cue, a shot rang out from the ridge, not from Eleanor's position, but from one of her allies. The bullet kicked up snow at Drake's feet, making him dance back. More shots followed, coming from multiple directions. The Thorne brothers' tactical advantage evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. "You're not the only one who's been planning, old friend," Eleanor's voice carried a grim satisfaction. "These past 2 years, while you were watching me, I was building something you never understood: community, loyalty, trust." Through the storm emerged figures Eleanor had carefully cultivated as allies. Michael Chen, the blacksmith who'd helped her reinforce the barn doors. Sarah Martinez, whose family Eleanor had protected from rustlers last spring. Old Tom Wheeler, whose marksmanship had earned him respect in 2 wars. Each one moved with purpose, taking up positions Eleanor had prepared. Long ago, Drake's face darkened as he realized the trap within the trap. You think these farmers and shopkeepers can stand against us, against men who've killed for sport? But there was something new in his voice. Uncertainty. I think, Eleanor replied, her confidence returning, that you forgot the most important lesson we learned in the hand. The one about how a person's true strength isn't in their gun hand, it's in the people willing to stand beside them. Rebecca watched as more townspeople emerged from the storm, each one carrying a weapon, each one moving to predetermined positions. Eleanor hadn't just been teaching Rebecca these past 2 years. She'd been preparing the entire community for this moment. You see, William, Eleanor continued, while you were studying my tactics, learning my tricks, I was building something you never could, something that all your planning and watching couldn't account for. The wind carried her words. Across the yard, I was building a family. James Carson, sensing the shift in power, made a desperate grab for his dropped gun, but before he could reach it, a shot from Sarah Martinez sent him scrambling back. Lucas's attempt to reach the barn was similarly thwarted by Chen's precise fire. Young Cooper, his earlier bravado completely shattered, dropped to his knees in the snow. William Drake stood motionless, his cold eyes taking in the situation. The fortress he thought he had figured out had just revealed another layer of defense. Not walls or weapons, but people willing to risk their lives for the widow who had protected them. Remember what you used to say about legends, William? Eleanor's voice carried clearly despite the storm. About how the best ones are built on truth. The wind died down for a moment, revealing just how many rifles were now trained on Drake and the Thorne brothers. Well, here's the truth you missed while you were watching so carefully. Silent Eleanor Reed didn't die in Kansas City. She didn't even retire. She just found something worth protecting. The storm continued to rage around Shadow Creek Valley, but within its fury, a new kind of strength had emerged. The quiet widow, who had seemed an easy target, had transformed not just herself, but an entire community into something Drake and the Thorne brothers had never anticipated. A force united by loyalty, trained by experience, and ready to defend their own. The winter storm paused, as if nature itself was holding its breath to witness what would unfold in Shadow Creek Valley. William Drake stood in the center of the yard, his calculating eyes taking in every detail of the situation he thought he had controlled. The Thorne brothers, Marcus still nursing his maimed hand, and Lucas without his fancy guns, had clustered near him, while young Cooper remained kneeling in the snow, all pretense of bravado stripped away. Impressive, Eleanor, Drake's voice carried. A dangerous edge. Very impressive, but you've overlooked something crucial. His hand moved slightly, drawing attention to the lamat hidden beneath his coat. The same thing you overlooked in Kansas City. Eleanor's response was immediate. You mean the backup shooters you've got positioned in the tree line? Her voice carried a hint of satisfaction that made Drake's eyes narrow. The ones who've been trying to work their way around to the North Ridge for the past hour. On cue, shots rang out from multiple directions. A moment later, 4 men emerged from the woods, with their hands raised, Robert Chen and old Tom Wheeler marching them forward at rifle point. Drake's face darkened as another layer of his carefully laid plan crumbled. You always did like to keep an ace in your sleeve, Eleanor, Drake continued, but his voice carried less certainty now, still thinking like an operative instead of an old widow. That's where you're wrong again, William, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying both sadness and steel. You saw an opportunity for profit. I saw a responsibility to something larger than ourselves. She turned to face her people fully, just like what we've built here is larger than any one of us. Rebecca suddenly understood all those lessons in the root cellar, learning to hide things in plain sight, to create hiding places that looked natural. She wasn't just being trained to survive, she was being taught to protect, to carry on a legacy that went beyond mere killing. The documents are still out there, Drake said, but it wasn't a question. hidden with people like these, ordinary folks who've learned to be extraordinary." His voice carried a mix of grudging admiration and bitter realization. Eleanor moved among her people, touching shoulders, meeting eyes, acknowledging the bond that had been forged in fire. That's what James understood, what he died protecting. Real change doesn't come from lone operators or clever schemes. It comes from communities standing together, from ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things. The last light faded. From the valley, as Eleanor's words sank in, her people understood now that they weren't just defending a homestead or protecting a widow. They were part of something larger, a network of justice that operated not through violence, but through the quiet strength of people standing together. "Let me tell you what really happened that day in Kansas City, William," Eleanor's voice cut through the growing darkness. "About why I let everyone think silent Eleanor Reed had died." She paused, letting the weight of the moment build. "I finally understood something you never did about true strength." Drake's hand twitched closer to his hidden lamat, but he knew better than to draw. Not yet. Not with so many rifles trained on him and the Thorne brothers. "Always the teacher, aren't you, Eleanor? Always trying to make everyone see the deeper." Meaning, "No, William, I'm trying to give you one last chance, one last opportunity to walk away from this path that's brought nothing but death and pain." The wind carried her words across the yard. "The same chance I tried to give you in St. Louis before you chose vengeance over redemption." The storm clouds above Shadow Creek Valley had begun to break, letting shafts of winter sunlight pierce the gloom. They illuminated a scene that had transformed from a simple homestead ambush into something far more complex. A community united against those who would threaten it, guided by a legend who had found purpose beyond the speed of her draw. "You know what James discovered?" Eleanor continued, watching Drake's face carefully. "He found proof that you were selling Serpent's Hand secrets to the highest bidder. Names, safe houses, mission details, all going to the very people we were supposed to be fighting." Drake's composed facade cracked slightly. "Those documents would have made us rich beyond imagination, Eleanor. The bribes those criminals offered for their destruction could have set us up for life. Instead, you and James chose to play heroes." "And that's the difference between us, William," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying both sadness and conviction. "You saw an opportunity for profit. James and I saw a responsibility to something larger than ourselves." She turned to face her people fully. "Just like what we've built here is larger than any one person." Rebecca suddenly remembered finding an old journal hidden in Eleanor's dresser, its pages filled with coded messages and locations. Now she understood. It wasn't just a record of past missions, it was a map of justice waiting to be served. "The territorial governor won't like this," Drake warned, though his tone carried more bitterness than threat. "Armed towns, trained civilians, organized resistance. It's not the kind of thing that makes corrupt officials comfortable." He paused, studying Eleanor's face, "especially not with those documents still out there." Eleanor's smile carried decades of hard-won wisdom. "That's exactly why it needs to happen. The frontier's changing, William. The days of lone operators and roving killers are ending, but the need for justice, for communities to protect themselves, that's only growing stronger." Michael Chen approached, carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth. "The modifications to the barn door are complete, Mrs. Matthews, and we've started implementing those new security measures you suggested." He unwrapped the package, revealing a newly forged set of tools that could serve both peaceful and defensive purposes. "Good," Eleanor nodded, seeing how naturally her people had adapted to their dual roles. "Remember what I taught you about layers of defense? Every improvement should look ordinary to outsiders, but serve multiple purposes for those who know." Sarah Martinez joined them, her rifle slung comfortably across her back as she delivered. Her report: the outlying farms are organizing their own training groups after word spread about the Thorn Gang. Every homestead wants to learn what you taught us. Her voice carried pride mixed with responsibility. And they will, Eleanor assured her, but not just the shooting and the fighting. They need to learn the harder lessons about community, about standing together, about choosing protection over violence. She turned back to Drake. That's what makes this different from just another armed camp. Drake watched as the townspeople went about their business, noting how seamlessly they integrated their new defensive roles with their daily lives. Farmers carried rifles as naturally as they did pitchforks. Children played games that doubled as surveillance practice. Even the town's layout had subtly shifted to provide better security while maintaining its peaceful appearance. You've started something here, Eleanor, Drake observed. Something bigger than just one town defending itself. You've created a model that others will want to follow. He gestured to where the Thorn brothers sat in defeat. Even your enemies can see it. Eleanor moved among her people, each interaction demonstrating the deeper changes that had taken root. Martha wasn't just a healer anymore. She was teaching others how to treat wounds under fire. Tom Wheeler's war stories had transformed into practical lessons about coordination and teamwork. Every skill, every lesson, every improvement served the dual purpose of building both community and security. The real change, Eleanor explained, watching Rebecca lead another group of children through their observation exercises, isn't in the weapons or the tactics. It's in helping people understand that true strength comes from standing together, that protecting others is more powerful than any gun. As the confrontation reached its climax, Drake made his final play. His hand moved toward his lamat with the same lethal speed that had made him legendary. But Eleanor had anticipated this too. Her shot caught his gun hand perfectly, sending the weapon spinning into the snow. You forgot the most important lesson I taught you, William, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of years. The perfect shot isn't about speed or accuracy. It's about knowing exactly when to take it. Drake looked at his bleeding hand, then at the community that had outmaneuvered him. For the first time, real understanding seemed to dawn in his eyes. You've changed, Eleanor. The woman I trained wouldn't have left any witnesses. You're right, Eleanor agreed, stepping into full view, her Remington steady. I changed the moment I realized that the strongest legacy isn't built on fear or death. It's built on teaching others to stand together, to protect rather than destroy. Drake's laugh was bitter in the winter air. And what about the blood on your hands, Eleanor? The lives you took? Those don't wash away just because you've found redemption in playing protector. No, they don't, Eleanor acknowledged, surprising everyone with her candor. The skills I learned, the lives I took, those can't be undone, but they can be transformed. She gestured to the valley around them. Every skill I taught these people came from those violent years, but now those same skills protect rather than destroy. Martha, still keeping her rifle trained on Drake, nodded in understanding. Like how you taught me to know where a bullet might be lodged by understanding how you used to place your shots, or how Mr. Chen learned to reinforce doors by knowing how others might try to break them down. The winter sun climbed higher, illuminating the valley that had become more than just a hiding place. Eleanor moved among her people, each interaction carrying new meaning. She showed Sarah Martinez how to adjust her rifle sights using techniques learned in a dozen silent eliminations. She demonstrated to Robert how to spot a hidden weapon by remembering how she used to conceal her own. The world's changing, William, Eleanor announced, addressing not just her former mentor, but the Thorn brothers as well. The old ways of the lone killer, shadows prowling the frontier, that's fading. But the need for protection, for justice, for standing together against those who would prey on the weak, that never changes. Young Cooper, still under guard but listening intently, spoke up. Could you teach others? people who want to change." His voice carried both hope and uncertainty. "Not the killing parts, but the protecting parts." Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. "That's exactly what James would have wanted. Transformation rather than elimination. When you've served your time, assuming you're serious about changing, come back to Shadow Creek Valley. We'll see if you're ready to learn the harder path." The day continued, full of activity and purpose. The territorial marshal would arrive soon, justice would take its course, but something more important was taking shape in Shadow Creek Valley. Silent Eleanor Reed's legend had not just survived, it had evolved into something stronger, something that could be passed down through generations. "Each of you," Eleanor addressed her people as they worked, "carries a piece of the skills I learned in violence, but you've transformed them into something better. You're not just defenders, you're teachers, protectors, builders of something that will outlast any killer's reputation." William Drake watched this transformation, with complex emotions playing across his face. The operative he had trained had not just survived, she had transcended their violent past to create something he had never imagined possible. The legend he had tried to destroy had instead become immortal in the most unexpected way. The marshal's arrival in Shadow Creek Valley brought with it the weight of official justice, but the community that greeted him bore little resemblance to the quiet farming town he'd known before. The changes weren't just in the armed men and women who carefully watched his approach, or in the professional way they secured his prison wagon. The transformation was deeper, written in how they carried themselves, how they moved together, how they understood their place in a larger purpose. "Quite a story you've got here, Eleanor," Marshal Jenkins said quietly. After Drake, the Thorn. Brothers and their men were secured. He'd known her in her operative days, had helped spread the tale of her supposed death in Kansas City. "Word of this is going to spread. You know that. Other communities will want to know how one town stood up to William Drake and the Thorn Gang." Eleanor stood on her porch, watching as her people continued their work of rebuilding and strengthening the valley's defenses. "Let it spread," she replied, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "What we've built here isn't meant to be a secret anymore. It's meant to be an example." Inside the cabin, Rebecca Wilson was teaching younger children the same observation games Eleanor had once taught her, but now these lessons carried new weight, new purpose. The children weren't just learning to spot details, they were learning to be part of something larger than themselves. "The territorial governor won't like this," Jenkins warned, though his tone carried more admiration than concern. "Armed towns, trained civilians, organized resistance, it's not the kind of thing that makes politicians comfortable." He paused, studying Eleanor's face. "Especially not with those documents still out there." Eleanor's smile carried decades of hard-won wisdom. "That's exactly why it needs to happen. The frontier's changing, John. The days of lone killers and roving gangs are ending, but the need for justice, for communities to protect themselves, that's only growing stronger." Michael Chen approached, carrying something wrapped in waxed cloth. "The modifications to the barn door are complete, Mrs. Matthews, and we've started implementing those new security measures you suggested." He unwrapped the package, revealing a newly forged set of tools that could serve both peaceful and defensive purposes. "Good," Eleanor nodded, seeing how naturally her people had adapted to their dual roles. "Remember what I taught you about layers of defense? Every improvement should look ordinary to outsiders, but serve multiple purposes for those who know." Sarah Martinez joined them, her rifle slung comfortably across her back as she delivered her report. "The outlying farms are organizing their own training groups after word spread about today's fight. Every homestead wants to learn what you taught us." Her voice carried pride mixed with responsibility. From the prison wagon, Drake's voice suddenly cut through the activity. "You really think this will last, Eleanor? That you can turn farmers into fighters without losing what made them farmers in the first place?" Eleanor turned to face her former mentor. No, William, I'm turning them into something new, people who can both nurture and protect. That's what you never understood about true strength. It's not about choosing between being a sword or a plowshare. It's about knowing when to be each. The marshal watched as the townspeople went about their business, noting how seamlessly they integrated their new defensive roles with their daily lives. Farmers carried rifles as naturally as they did pitchforks. Children played games that doubled as surveillance practice. Even the town's layout had subtly shifted to provide better security while maintaining its peaceful appearance. "You've started something here, Eleanor," Jenkins observed. "Something bigger than just one town defending itself. You created a model that others will want to follow." He gestured to where the prisoners sat watching the scene. "Even your enemies can see it." Eleanor moved among her people, each interaction demonstrating the deeper changes that had taken root. Martha wasn't just a healer anymore. She was teaching others how to treat wounds under fire. Tom Wheeler's war stories had transformed into practical lessons about coordination and teamwork. Every skill, every lesson, every improvement served the dual purpose of building both community and security. "The real change," Eleanor explained, watching Rebecca lead another group of children through their observation exercises, "isn't in the weapons or the tactics. It's in helping people understand that true strength comes from standing together, that protecting others is more powerful than any gun." As the day progressed, more riders arrived from neighboring communities, drawn by word of what had happened. With Drake and the Thorn Gang, they found not a battlefield, but a thriving town, one that had learned to balance peace with preparedness, strength with wisdom. "Each person who comes here seeking just the gun skills," Eleanor told Jenkins as they watched the newcomers arrive, "will learn what James taught me, that the hardest battles are won not with bullets, but with choices. Choices about who we become, about what we stand for." The marshal nodded thoughtfully, understanding the fuller implications of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just one town's response to a threat. It was the beginning of a new way of thinking about frontier justice and community protection. "The legend of silent Eleanor Reed will still spread," he noted, "but not as a tale of lone vengeance anymore. This is something different, something that could change the whole territory." His eyes tracked the smooth coordination of the townspeople, going about their work, something that already is changing it. Eleanor touched the Remington at her side, the weapon that had once defined her, but now served a different purpose. "That's exactly what James would have wanted. Not just the end of one legend, but the beginning of something stronger, something that can't be killed by bullets or broken by betrayal." As the sun climbed high over Shadow Creek Valley, illuminating a community that had been transformed not just by conflict, but by choice, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't known since James's death. The quiet widow, who had seemed an easy target, had helped forge something unprecedented, a town where every member was both protector and protected, where strength meant more than just the speed of a draw or the accuracy of a shot. Young Cooper, being led to the prison wagon, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Matthews," his voice carried a mix of fear and hope, "that offer about coming back after serving time, did you mean it?" Eleanor studied him carefully. "I meant every word. There's always a path to redemption for those willing to walk. It's not an easy path. Just ask your fellow prisoners, but it's there." Lucas Thorne spat in the snow. "You're soft, woman. All this talk of redemption and protection, it's just weakness dressed up in pretty words." "Is it?" Eleanor's voice carried a steel edge that made the outlaw flinch. "Tell me, Mr. Thorne, which shows more strength, standing alone against the world, or teaching others to stand together? Which leaves a more lasting legacy, the fear you inspire or the protection you provide?" The marshal's men began preparing the prisoners for transport, but Eleanor's attention was already shifting to the future. She could see it in the way Rebecca now moved with quiet confidence, in how the townspeople carried themselves with both pride and purpose, in the eager faces of the newcomers seeking to learn what Shadow Creek Valley had to teach. "You know what comes next," Jenkins said quietly. "Once word spreads about what happened here, about what you've built, others will come. Not just those seeking protection, but those wanting to destroy what you've created." Eleanor's smile held. "No fear. Let them come. They'll find more than just one retired operative waiting for them. They'll find a community that knows how to protect its own." She watched as Michael Chen began teaching a group of newcomers about reinforcing building materials, while Sarah Martinez demonstrated proper rifle maintenance to another group. "Besides," she added, "the best defense isn't in our guns or our fortifications. It's in what we're building here, a legacy of protection that spreads from town to town, teaching others that true strength lies not in how many you can kill, but in how many you can teach to protect themselves." Drake watched this exchange from the prison wagon, his expression unreadable. "Tell me something, Eleanor," he called out. "What happens when your peaceful farmers face someone who doesn't play by any rules? Someone who doesn't care about redemption or second chances?" Eleanor turned to face him, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "They'll face them the same way we faced you today, William. With preparation, with unity, and with the understanding that true victory isn't about who's left standing. It's about what's left standing." The winter day was drawing to a close, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and purple. Eleanor Matthews stood among her people, the Remington still ready at her side, but no longer the only source of protection. She had transformed not just herself, but an entire community, turning a legend of lone vengeance into a story of shared strength. "Mrs. Matthews," Rebecca called out, using the name that was no longer just a cover, but a symbol of transformation. "I've been thinking about those ledgers you taught me to keep. They're not just about recording supplies, are they? They're codes, ways to pass information without drawing attention." Eleanor smiled, seeing how her careful lessons had taken root. "Smart girl. Just like those reading lessons weren't just about letters and words. Everything serves multiple purposes when you're building something meant to last." She gathered her people closer, knowing it was time for the next phase of their evolution. "Yesterday wasn't just about defending our homes," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "It was about choosing what kind of community we want to be. The Thorn Gang thought they were facing one retired operative. Instead, they found something far more powerful, people who had learned to stand together." As the sun set over Shadow Creek Valley, plans were already being made. Martha was expanding her healing practice to include combat medicine. Michael Chen's forge would become a school for both blacksmithing and defensive innovations. Sarah Martinez was organizing a network of patrol routes that would protect not just their valley, but the surrounding homesteads as well. "You know what James used to say about change?" Eleanor asked the gathered townspeople. "He said it happens in two ways, either through crisis or through choice. Today, we proved we could handle the crisis. Now comes the harder part, choosing what we become next." From the prison wagon, Marcus Thorne, his bandaged hand a constant reminder of his miscalculation, spoke up. "All this talk of community and protection, you're still a killer, Reed. We all are. That's something that doesn't wash off." "You're right," Eleanor acknowledged, surprising everyone with her candor. "The skills I learned, the lives I took, those can't be undone, but they can be transformed." She gestured to the valley around them. "Every skill I taught these people came from those violent years, but now those same skills protect rather than destroy." Martha, attending to a minor injury one of the townspeople had sustained during the fight, nodded in understanding. "Like how you taught me to know where a bullet might be lodged by understanding how you used to place your shots, or how Mr. Chen learned to reinforce doors by knowing how others might try to break them down." The winter sun climbed higher, illuminating the valley that had become more than just a hiding place. Eleanor moved among her people, each interaction carrying new meaning. She showed Sarah Martinez how to adjust her rifle sights using techniques, learned in a dozen silent eliminations. She demonstrated to Robert how to spot a hidden weapon by remembering how she used to conceal her own. "The world's changing," Eleanor announced, addressing not just the prisoners but everyone gathered. "The old ways of the lone killer, shadows prowling the frontier, that's fading. But the need for protection, for justice, for standing together against those who would prey on the weak, that never changes." As evening approached, more riders appeared on the horizon, representatives from neighboring communities who had heard about the confrontation. Eleanor watched them approach, seeing not just curiosity in their faces, but hope. They had come seeking more than just tales of how one town had defeated a notorious gang. They had come looking for a new way forward. "Each person who comes here," Eleanor told the marshal as they watched the newcomers arrive, "will learn the same thing I did, that true strength isn't about how many battles you win. It's about how many people you teach to stand together, to protect rather than destroy." The sun was setting over Shadow Creek Valley, but something new was dawning, a legacy that would spread across the frontier, teaching others that the strongest communities weren't built on fear of the gun, but on the courage to stand together and protect what mattered most. A month after Drake's defeat and the Thorne brothers' capture, Shadow Creek Valley had become something unprecedented in the Dakota Territory. The quiet farming community had transformed into a beacon of hope for other towns plagued by lawlessness. Eleanor Matthews, still known to most as the widow who ran the valley's most prosperous homestead, found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to create. 3 more families arrived yesterday, Rebecca Wilson reported during their morning meeting. The girl, now a young woman in bearing if not quite in years, had taken on the role of coordinating the valley's growing network of defenders. They heard about what happened with Drake and the Thorns. They're looking for more than just safety. They want to learn. Eleanor stood at her cabin window, watching the morning activities in the valley below. Michael Chen's smithy now doubled as a training ground where he taught others how to forge both tools and defenses. Sarah Martinez led daily patrols that looked like simple hunting parties to outsiders, but maintained a vigilant watch over the community. "And what did you tell these families?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. She had trained Rebecca well, not just in observation and tactics, but in understanding the deeper purpose behind their work. "I told them what you taught me," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying the confidence of hard-won wisdom. "That true security isn't about guns or fences. It's about building something worth protecting and then teaching others to protect it too." The morning sun caught the silver in Eleanor's hair as she moved to the porch where several of the town's leaders had gathered for their daily council. Martha, Tom Wheeler, and the others had adapted their regular roles to include new responsibilities, creating a system of community defense that looked utterly natural to outside eyes. "Word came from Helena," Tom reported, his weathered face serious. "Drake's trial is set for next month, but that's not the important news." He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "Those documents you and James protected, they're starting to make waves. 3 territorial judges have been removed for corruption. 2 more resigned before they could be investigated." Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling the weight of James's sacrifice and its continuing impact. He always said, "The truth was more powerful than any bullet." Turns out he was right about that, like he was right about so many things. A rider approached from the valley's entrance, and Eleanor noted with pride how smoothly the community's defensive measures activated. Signals passed between watch points, positions were adjusted, all without any obvious movement that would alarm an innocent traveler. The rider turned out to be Marshal Jenkins, returning from his escort of Drake and the Thorn gang to Helena. His expression carried news before he even dismounted. "Thought you should hear this from me, Eleanor. Young Cooper asked about your offer again. Says he's ready to talk about everything, the corruption, the bribes, the whole network that Drake was protecting." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, but Eleanor remained calm. Cooper's testimony could help break open the last remnants of the corruption that she and James had fought against, but her expression remained thoughtful. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked, reading the marshal's face like she'd taught her people to read approaching riders. Jenkins nodded. He also asked if that offer was still open, about learning a different path once he's served his time. "Seems your example is affecting more than just honest folks." Eleanor moved to the edge of her porch, looking out over the valley that had become so much more than just a hiding place. Children played games that doubled as training exercises, women worked at tasks that maintained both home and security, men carried tools that could serve as weapons if needed, but none of it looked military or threatening. Just a community that had learned to protect its own. "You know what the most dangerous part of redemption is, John?" she asked, her voice carrying to all those gathered. "It's not about erasing the past, but about choosing a different future. About taking the skills and experiences that shaped us and turning them toward something better." Rebecca stepped forward, her young face serious. "That's what you've been teaching us all along, isn't it? Not just how to fight, but how to choose when not to fight. How to build something strong enough that it doesn't need to prove its strength." The morning breeze carried the scent of spring, of new growth and possibility. Eleanor touched the serpent, mark on Remington's grip, feeling the weight of all it represented. The legend of silent Eleanor Reed used to be about how many men she could kill, she said quietly. Now it's about how many people she can teach to protect life. Instead, Marshal Jenkins surveyed the valley, noting the subtle signs of preparation and readiness that underlay its peaceful appearance. "You've started something here, Eleanor, something that could change the whole territory. These people aren't just defending their homes. They're building a new way of thinking about justice and community." Eleanor watched as her students, for they were all her students now, whether they carried guns or plows, went about their daily tasks. Each one moved with the awareness she had taught them. Each one understood their role in the larger purpose. "They served. That's what James died protecting," she replied, her voice firm with conviction. "Not just documents or evidence, but the chance for real change. The opportunity to build something that could grow and spread, teaching others that true strength comes from standing together." A group of newcomers was gathering near Chen's smithy, eager to learn his techniques for reinforcing everyday items into subtle defenses. Sarah Martinez had begun training another set of hunters in the art of patrolling disguised as hunting parties. Even the children's games had taken on new meaning, teaching observation and coordination under the guise of play. "You know what Thomas used to say about real change?" Eleanor asked, watching the valley's activities unfold. "He said it happens in 3 ways, through crisis, through choice, or through example. Drake and the Thorns brought the crisis. We made our choice about how to face it. Now we're becoming the example others can follow." The marshal considered this, watching as more riders appeared on the horizon, representatives from other communities seeking to learn Shadow Creek Valley's methods. And what happens when those who profited from the old ways try to stop this? Change? When they realize that empowered communities are bad for their business? Eleanor's smile held no fear. Then they'll learn what Drake learned, that you can't defeat a community that stands together, that the strongest defense isn't in weapons or walls, but in people who know how to protect each other. She moved among her people, each interaction, demonstrating the deeper changes that had taken root. Martha wasn't just teaching healing anymore. She was showing others how to set up informal clinics that could serve as safe houses. Tom Wheeler's patrol routes had become a model for other communities to adopt, creating a network of mutual protection that grew stronger each day. "Look there," Eleanor pointed to where Rebecca was teaching a group of children one of their observation games. Those children aren't just playing. They're learning to be part of something larger than themselves. They're learning that strength isn't about standing alone, but about helping others stand with you. The valley hummed with purposeful activity, each task serving multiple roles, just as Eleanor had taught them. Chen's smithy produced tools that could become weapons if needed, but their primary purpose was to build and create. Martinez's hunting parties brought back game while maintaining security. Even the social gatherings served as coordination exercises, teaching people to work together smoothly without obvious organization. "You know the governor's getting nervous," Jenkins mentioned, watching all this unfold. Armed communities, organized, defense networks, people learning to stand up for themselves. It's not what the politicians had in mind for the territory. Eleanor's response carried the weight of experience. Good. Maybe that nervousness will remind them who they're supposed to be serving. James always said that the best defense against corruption isn't force, it's making it impossible to hide. As if to emphasize her point, more riders appeared on the horizon, not seekers this time, but messengers. Sarah Martinez's network of patrol routes had evolved into an informal communication system, carrying news between communities that had adopted Shadow Creek Valley's methods. "Word from the Blackwater settlement," one rider reported after dismounting. "They drove off the Carson gang using the defense patterns you taught them. No casualties on either side." His voice carried pride, mixed with amazement. "They said the outlaws didn't even know what hit them, kept finding themselves herded into dead ends and crossfire positions." Eleanor nodded, satisfaction warming her heart. That's exactly how it should work. The best victory isn't the one won with bullets. It's the one that teaches others they can't prey on those who stand together. Martha approached with her own report, medical bag in hand. "The healing network is growing too. 5 more settlements have set up clinics disguised as ordinary homesteads. We're not just treating wounds anymore. We're creating safe havens, places where people can find protection without drawing attention." The transformation was spreading faster than even Eleanor had anticipated. What had started as one town's defense against the Thorn Gang had become a movement, teaching communities not just to protect themselves, but to support each other. "You know what this reminds me of?" Jenkins mused, watching the activity. The Underground Railroad during the war. Ordinary people turning their homes into waypoints, creating networks of safety right under the noses of those who'd stop them. "That's no coincidence," Eleanor replied softly. James was part of that network before he became a banker. It's where he learned that the strongest chains aren't made of iron, they're made of people helping people. Rebecca, who had been listening intently, suddenly understood something. "That's why you insist everything we do has to look ordinary from the outside. Why even our defense training is disguised as normal activities." "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "True strength isn't about showing power. It's about building it so naturally that by the time others notice, it's already too deep to uproot." The winter wind carried across the valley, but it held a hint of spring. Now, of change and growth. Eleanor watched as Chen demonstrated to a group of visiting blacksmiths how to forge hinges that could quickly transform into barricades. Nearby, Tom Wheeler's war stories had evolved into lessons about community coordination, teaching others how to turn ordinary town activities into subtle defense networks. "Tell me something, Eleanor," Jenkins said quietly. "Did you plan all this? When you first settled here after James's death, did you envision building something this big?" Eleanor's laugh carried no bitterness now, only wisdom. "Plan it? No, but James and we dreamed about something like it. A way to fight corruption and violence, not by becoming better killers, but by teaching people to be stronger together. She touched the serpent mark on her Remington, feeling how its meaning had changed. Silent Eleanor Reed died because she had to. The legend of a lone killer, no matter how skilled, couldn't build what we needed. But her skills, her knowledge, those could be transformed into something more powerful. As the day progressed, Eleanor watched her legacy take shape in ways she had never imagined. Children's games taught situational awareness, social gatherings doubled as coordination exercises, and even the town's gossip network had been transformed into an early warning system. You've done more than build a defense network, Jenkins observed. You've created a new kind of community, one that protects itself by becoming stronger, not just better armed. Eleanor's smile carried the peace she had finally found. That's what James understood, what he died protecting. Real strength isn't about how many you can fight. It's about how many you can teach to stand together. That's a legacy that can't be killed by bullets or broken by betrayal. The sun began its descent over Shadow Creek Valley, painting the sky in colors of promise. Eleanor Matthews, once known as Silent Eleanor Reed, stood among her people, watching as the seeds of change she and James had planted continued to grow and spread. The legend of the deadly operative wasn't dead. It had transformed, like Eleanor herself, into something far more powerful. Not a tale of lone vengeance, but a story of community and protection, teaching others that the strongest defense comes not from the speed of a draw or the accuracy of a shot, but from the courage to stand together and protect what matters most. 3 months after Drake's capture, the first real challenge to Shadow Creek Valley's growing influence arrived with the spring thaw. Eleanor Matthews stood on her porch in the crisp morning air, reading a message that had just arrived through Sarah. "Martinez's network of riders. Trouble?" Rebecca asked, noting the slight tension in her mentor's shoulders, a tell that most would have missed, but one Eleanor had taught her to recognize. "Word from Willow Creek," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the calm that preceded action. "Judge Harrison's men have been closing down their community meetings, claiming they're unlawful gatherings that threaten territorial security." The news spread quickly through the valley's now well-established communication network. Within hours, the town's leaders had gathered at Eleanor's homestead, each bringing reports from their own contacts across the territory. "It's not just Willow Creek," Michael Chen reported, his blacksmith's apron still dusted with forge smoke. 3 other settlements have faced similar pressure. Officials claiming their hunting parties are unauthorized militias and their community storehouses are stockpiling weapons. Tom Wheeler's weathered face carried a grim understanding. "Harrison, he's one of the judges named in James's documents, isn't he?" Eleanor nodded, her silver-streaked hair catching the morning light. "Third name on the list. Seems he's finally realized what our little community network means for his operations." Martha, who had expanded her healing practice into a territory-wide network of safe houses, spoke up. "They're trying to isolate the communities, break down the connections we've built. Last week they even tried to shut down my medical training sessions, claiming I needed official certification." The gathered leaders watched as Eleanor moved to her familiar position by the window, where she could observe the valley's activities while thinking. They had learned to read her moods, to understand that her quietest moments often preceded her most important decisions. "You know what James used to say about corruption?" She finally spoke, her voice carrying to all gathered. "He said it's like rotten wood. It can't survive exposure to light. That's why they're moving now, trying to push us back into darkness and isolation." Rebecca, who had grown into her role as the valley's chief coordinator, understood immediately. They're not trying to stop us from fighting. They're trying to stop us from connecting, from teaching each other. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. But they've made the same mistake Drake did. They think they're dealing with a military threat, something they can fight with laws and guns. They don't understand what we've really built here. Outside, the valley hummed with its usual activity. Children played their observation games. Hunters conducted their disguised patrols. And Chen's forge rang with the sound of tools being made and lessons being taught. But there was a new awareness in the air, a sense that everything they had built was facing its first real test. "So what do we do?" Sarah Martinez asked, her rifle slung casually across her back in a way that looked natural to any observer. "We can't fight the territorial government directly." Eleanor's smile carried the wisdom that had made her legend transform from death to life. "We don't fight them at all. We do what we've been doing all along. We teach, we connect, we protect. But now we do it in ways they can't touch without exposing themselves." The next hours were spent in careful planning, each leader contributing their understanding of how their seemingly ordinary activities could be adapted to meet this new challenge. Chen's smithy would start hosting trade apprenticeships that taught more than just metalworking. Martha's healing sessions would become public health meetings that covered more than just medicine. "Remember what I taught you about layers," Eleanor instructed as they refined their plans. "Everything we do must look completely innocent to outsiders, while serving multiple purposes for those who know." Word was sent out through their network of riders, each message carefully coded in the innocent language of trade and social gatherings. The communities that had adopted Shadow Creek Valley's methods would need to adapt, to make their defensive preparations even more subtle while maintaining their effectiveness. "They'll be watching for weapons," Tom Wheeler noted, his military experience adding weight to his words, "looking for anything that could be called a militia gathering." "Then we'll give them nothing to see," Eleanor replied. "Our strength isn't in weapons, it's in how we work together. A community that knows how to coordinate, how to support each other, is harder to defeat than any armed force." As if to demonstrate her point, a commotion at the valley's entrance triggered their warning system. Within moments, positions had been adjusted, observers were in place, and the community's defensive network had activated, all without a single obvious movement or visible signal. The approaching riders turned out to be a family seeking shelter, driven from their home by Harrison's men for hosting community meetings. Eleanor watched as her people smoothly absorbed them, providing comfort and support while quietly incorporating them into the valley's defense network. "You see," she said to the gathered leaders, "that's what they can't fight. How do you outlaw kindness? How do you prevent people from helping their neighbors? Every person they drive from their home becomes part of our network, learning our methods, spreading our true strength." Rebecca, who had been taking notes throughout the meeting, suddenly understood something deeper. The documents James died protecting, they were important, but they weren't the real weapon against corruption, were they? Eleanor's eyes carried pride at her student's insight. No, they weren't. James understood that exposing corruption was only the first step. The real change would come from teaching people they didn't have to face it alone, that they could stand together in ways the corrupt couldn't fight. The morning progressed into afternoon as more reports arrived from across the territory. Harrison's men were moving aggressively, but their very actions were causing exactly what they feared most. Communities were drawing closer together, sharing resources and knowledge, strengthening the very networks they were trying to break. "Think about it," Eleanor continued, addressing all gathered. "Every time they shut down a public meeting, people gather in homes instead, sharing knowledge more discreetly. Every time they question a hunting party, our patrol networks become more subtle and effective. They're teaching us to be stronger, whether they realize it or not." Sarah Martinez returned from her afternoon patrol with news that brought grim smiles to every face. 3 more families arrived in Copper Creek last night, all saying they're just visiting relatives. They've already started teaching others what they learned here about community defense. And that's what makes this network unbeatable, Eleanor explained, satisfaction warming her voice. It doesn't depend on weapons or formal training. It spreads through everyday actions. A parent teaching children to watch their surroundings, neighbors learning to coordinate their daily routines, communities sharing resources and knowledge. The sun was beginning its descent when Marshal Jenkins arrived, his expression caught between professional concern and personal approval. Harrison's pushing for territorial law against unauthorized community organizations, he reported. Says they're a threat to proper governance. Of course he does, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying no worry, but he's already too late. You can't outlaw what you can't see, and you can't stop people from teaching each other to be stronger. Together, as if to prove her point, the evening brought more subtle signs of their network's strength. Women gathering for what appeared to be a quilting circle were actually sharing patrol schedules coded into their patterns. Children playing tag in the street were practicing the valley's warning signals. Even the regular evening social at the church was doubling as a coordination meeting for the territory's growing network of safe houses. You know what's truly remarkable? Martha observed, watching the community's seamless integration of defense and daily life. Every time they try to stop us, we become more creative. When they questioned my medical supplies, we started hiding them in plain sight. Regular household items that serve double purposes. Chen nodded in agreement. Same with my forge. They started asking about tool production. So now every blade we make can transform into a defensive barrier. Every wagon wheel hub contains a hidden compartment. They're looking for weapons while we're building protection into the very fabric of daily life. Eleanor moved to her familiar spot on the porch, watching the valley's evening activities with pride. That's because they're still thinking like Drake did, like I used to, before James showed me a better way. They see strength only in terms of force, of weapons and numbers. But real strength is in connections, Rebecca completed the thought, understanding dawning in her eyes. In how many ways people can help each other without anyone realizing it's happening. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. Harrison's not just pushing for laws against gatherings. He's bringing in hired guns, professional troublemakers. Says they're territorial deputies, but we all know what they really are. Eleanor's smile carried a hint of her old predator's edge. Good. Let them come. They'll find no weapons caches to seize, no militia meetings to break up, just communities going about their business, helping each other in ways too subtle to fight. Tom Wheeler, who had been quiet for most of the discussion, suddenly spoke up. Got word from my old army contacts. Harrison's men tried to break up a community gathering in Pine Ridge yesterday. Know what they found? Just a bunch of women teaching each other to preserve food for winter. And I bet those preserving techniques included methods for hiding messages in shipments between communities, Eleanor noted with satisfaction. While the recipes they shared probably contained coded information about patrol routes and safe houses. Night was falling over Shadow Creek Valley, but the community's activities didn't slow. If anything, they became more focused, more purposeful. Lanterns being lit in windows that seemed random to outsiders were actually signaling that all was well. The evening patrols looked like nothing more than neighbors taking late walks. Tomorrow, Eleanor announced to the gathered leaders, we start the next phase. Martha, your healing sessions will now include lessons on treating injuries without proper medical supplies, knowledge that might come in handy if certain officials try to restrict access to medicines. Chen, your apprenticeship program will expand to include more communities. Make sure every tool you teach them to make has at least 2 uses, one visible, one hidden. Sarah, your hunting parties will start teaching others how to track game in ways that look nothing like the patrol techniques they really are. And Rebecca, she turned to her primary student, you'll coordinate it all, making sure every lesson, every gathering, every shared skill strengthens our network while appearing completely innocent to those watching. As the leaders dispersed to their various duties, Marshal Jenkins lingered. You know they'll keep pushing, trying to break this apart. Harrison's already talking about restrictions on travel between communities, mandatory reporting of gatherings, even limitations on trade. Eleanor's response carried the quiet confidence of someone who had already won, though the battle was just beginning. Let them push. Every restriction they impose will only make our methods more subtle, our connections stronger. They're fighting shadows while we're building something as solid as the earth itself. She looked out over her valley, at the community that had grown from her simple homestead into something that was changing the entire territory. You can't defeat an idea whose time has come, John. And you certainly can't stop people from teaching each other to be strong together. The night settled over Shadow Creek Valley, but there was no rest in its darkness. The community's pulse continued, steady and strong, in the quiet movements of its people, in the subtle signals passing between homes, in the very breath of its existence. Eleanor Matthews, once known as Silent Eleanor Reed, had helped forge something that no law could break, no force could shatter, a network of communities that had learned to protect themselves by becoming something more than anyone had imagined possible. The confrontation that would test everything Shadow Creek Valley had built came on a warm spring morning, just as the last patches of snow were melting from the valley floor. Eleanor Matthews stood at her usual window, watching the sun rise over her community when Sarah Martinez's warning signal came. 3 sharp whistles that sounded like morning birdsong to any outsider. Harrison's men? Rebecca asked, already moving to her position without any obvious hurry or concern. The young woman had grown into her role as the valley's coordinator with a grace that made Eleanor proud. 24 riders approaching from the east, Eleanor confirmed, her keen eyes picking out details through the morning mist. Led by Marcus Shaw, Harrison's chief enforcer. I recognize him from James's documents. The valley's warning system activated with subtle precision. Children, playing in the streets, shifted their games to predetermined observation points. Women heading to their morning chores casually adjusted their routes to cover key positions. Men, going about their work, moved tools into places where they could serve other purposes if needed. They're trying to look casual, Martha reported from her position near the church, but they're spreading out in a standard military formation. Tom says it's typical for a town seizure operation. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. This was what she had been preparing her people for all along. Remember what we discussed, she sent word through their network. No weapons visible, no obvious resistance. Let them think they're in control. Marcus Shaw rode into Shadow Creek Valley like a man who expected to be feared. His reputation had been built on breaking up troublesome communities across 3 territories, always under the guise of enforcing territorial law. But as his men spread through the streets, he found himself facing something he didn't quite understand. There was no panic, no rushing to hide weapons or scramble defensive positions. Just ordinary people going about their morning routines. Women, gathered at the well, sharing what seemed to be gossip. Children continued their games, though they'd somehow shifted to places that gave them clear views of every approach. Men worked at their various trades, their tools placed with what might have seemed random convenience to an untrained eye. "Mrs. Matthews," Shaw called out as he approached Eleanor's homestead. His voice carried the false politeness that had preceded violence in a dozen other communities. "I have orders from Judge Harrison to inspect this settlement for unauthorized gatherings and illegal weapons caches." Eleanor stepped onto her porch, every inch the simple widow. "My goodness," she replied, her voice carrying just the right mix of confusion and concern. "I'm not sure what you mean by unauthorized gatherings. We're just simple folks here, trying to get by." Behind Shaw, his men were already moving to search buildings, but everywhere they went, they found themselves subtly guided by the layout of the town itself. Streets that seemed straight somehow led them in circles. Alleys that appeared to offer shortcuts channeled them away from anything important. "We have reports," Shaw continued, dismounting with practiced intimidation, "of paramilitary training, disguised as community meetings, of weapons being stockpiled under the guise of normal trade goods." "Paramilitary training?" Martha's voice carried perfect grandmotherly concern as she approached with her medical bag. "Oh my, no. I just teach basic health care to anyone who wants to learn. Would you like to see my classroom? It's right next to the church." Shaw's men were finding their search increasingly frustrating. Every building they entered had perfectly innocent explanations for everything they found. Chen's forge contained nothing but blacksmith's tools, though if they had known what to look for, they might have noticed how each implement could serve multiple purposes. "And these regular gatherings we've heard about?" Shaw pressed, his confidence starting to show cracks. "The ones that happen every evening? Our social circle." Rebecca stepped forward, the picture of youthful innocence. "Oh yes, we meet to share news and skills. Last night Mrs. Peterson was teaching us all about preserving vegetables for winter. Would you like to learn? She's ever so good at it." Throughout the valley, Shaw's men were encountering the same thing, complete cooperation that somehow revealed nothing, open doors that led nowhere suspicious, peaceful citizens going about their business in ways that left the searchers increasingly uncertain. "Sir," one of Shaw's lieutenants reported, frustration evident in his voice, "we've searched the main buildings, found nothing but normal tools and supplies, but something's not right. It's like the whole town is—" "Is what?" Shaw snapped, his practiced control slipping. "It's like it's resisting us without actually resisting," the man finished, unable to quite explain what he meant. Eleanor watched from her porch as Shaw's operation slowly unraveled. His men had come expecting to find weapons they could confiscate, meetings they could break up, leaders they could arrest. Instead, they found something they couldn't fight, a community going about its daily life in ways that offered no targets but somehow maintained perfect awareness and control of everything happening. "Your men look tired," Eleanor observed, her voice carrying motherly concern. "It's warm today for all that riding. Perhaps they'd like some water. Martha runs our community well program. Making sure everyone has access to clean water is so important, don't you think?" Shaw's eyes narrowed at her tone, sensing layers of meaning but unable to pin down anything specific. Around him, his men were growing increasingly unsettled. Every time they thought they'd found something suspicious, perfectly innocent explanations emerged. Every pattern they thought they'd detected shifted as soon as they looked closer. "The warehouse," Shaw decided, pointing to the large building near Chen's forge. "We have specific information about weapons being stored there." "Oh, the community storehouse." Chen emerged from his forge, wiping honest sweat from his brow. "Of course, come see. We keep our winter supplies there, shared with any family that needs help during hard times. It's all carefully documented. We believe in proper record-keeping." The storehouse, when Shaw's men searched it, contained exactly what Chen had described: carefully preserved food, basic supplies, and meticulous records of everything going in and out. If they had known the community's codes, they might have recognized that those same records contained detailed information about the territory's entire network of mutual support and defense. "Sir," another of Shaw's men approached, his voice low, "every time we try to corner anyone for questioning, they're either in plain sight doing something completely innocent, or we can't quite find them. But there's no sign of anyone hiding or running." Eleanor hid her satisfaction as she watched Shaw's growing frustration. Her people were performing exactly as they'd trained, though that training had looked nothing like military drills. Every daily activity in Shadow Creek Valley had multiple layers of purpose. Every routine contained elements of defense, and every person knew their role in the larger pattern. "Mrs. Matthews," Shaw tried again, his voice hardening, "we know this community is part of a larger network. We know you've been spreading dangerous ideas about community defense and mutual protection. Judge Harrison has declared these activities a threat to territorial order." Eleanor's response was a masterpiece of innocent concern. "My goodness, is helping our neighbors now against the law? Perhaps you could explain exactly which activities you find threatening. The quilting circle, the preservation classes, our community storehouse." As she spoke, subtle signals passed through the valley. Children's games shifted position again, maintaining perfect observation coverage while appearing completely random. Women at the well moved their conversation to a new location, adjusting the community's defensive pattern without a single obvious movement. "Don't play games with me." Shaw's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I've broken up a dozen communities like this. They all thought they were clever, all thought they could resist territorial authority." "Broken up?" Martha joined them, her voice carrying perfectly pitched elderly confusion. "But why would anyone want to break up neighbors helping neighbors? Just last week we helped the Anderson family rebuild their barn after that terrible fire. Is community support now forbidden?" Shaw's frustration was reaching a breaking point. His men had searched every building, questioned dozens of residents, and found absolutely nothing they could act against. Yet somehow the entire town seemed to be shifting around them, maintaining perfect awareness of their movements while appearing to do nothing at all. "The forge," Shaw suddenly announced. "We'll start there. Your smithy has been producing more than just farming tools, hasn't he?" "Oh, you must mean the apprenticeship program," Chen called out cheerfully. "Always happy to show visitors how we keep the community's equipment repaired. Would you like to see the plow blades we're working on? Spring planting is coming up fast." As Shaw and his men moved toward the forge, Eleanor noted how the community's pattern adjusted again. Rebecca's group of young people just happened to start a game of catch nearby, their positions perfect for observation. Sarah Martinez's hunting party returned from their morning route, their casual movements ensuring no part of the valley was left unwatched. "Sir," Shaw's lieutenant approached again, real concern in his voice now. "Something's wrong. We've been searching for hours, but it's like the whole town is in one big defensive position, but we can't find anything actually defensive. No weapons, no organized guards, just people going about their business." Eleanor watched Shaw's face as understanding finally began to dawn. His experience was with communities that tried to resist through force, that hid weapons and posted guards. He had no framework for dealing with a town that had made defense part of its very existence, where every daily activity served multiple purposes and every citizen was part of a living, breathing, defensive network. "You see, Mr. Shaw," Eleanor spoke up, her voice carrying gentle understanding, "you came looking for weapons, but our strength isn't in guns or fortifications. It's in how we live, how we work together, how we support each other. You can't break that up without breaking the very thing that makes a community function." Around them, Shadow Creek Valley continued its daily rhythms. Women shared recipes that contained coded messages about patrol routes. Children played games that maintained perfect surveillance. Men worked at tasks that kept every approach covered and every stranger observed. "Harrison won't accept this," Shaw warned, though his voice carried less conviction now. "He'll send others. He'll find a way to break whatever this is." Eleanor's smile carried decades of hard-won wisdom. "Others have tried, Mr. Shaw, but you can't break something that's woven into the very fabric of daily life. You can't outlaw neighbors helping neighbors or children playing games or women sharing recipes." As if to emphasize her point, the evening social circle began gathering at Martha's house. Women bringing dishes to share, men stopping by after work, everything appearing perfectly normal while maintaining complete awareness and control of the valley. "Tell Judge Harrison what you found here," Eleanor suggested gently. "Tell him about our community storehouse, our apprenticeship programs, our social gatherings. Tell him how we help each other through hard times and teach our children to be aware of their surroundings." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But also tell him this. What we've built here isn't just in Shadow Creek Valley anymore. It's in every community where neighbors have learned to stand together, where people have discovered that true strength comes from supporting each other, not from weapons or walls." Shaw looked around the valley one last time, seeing with new eyes how every aspect of the community worked together in ways he couldn't quite grasp. His men, gathered near their horses, looked equally unsettled. They had come to break up a resistance, movement, and found instead a way of life they couldn't touch without exposing their own corruption. "You've created something dangerous here," Shaw said finally, though his tone carried something close to admiration. "Something that could spread, that could change everything about how the territory works." Eleanor's response was simple but profound. "No, Mr. Shaw, we've remembered something that was always true, that a community that stands together, that weaves protection and support into its daily life, is stronger than any force that tries to break it apart." As Shaw and his men rode out of Shadow Creek Valley, Eleanor watched from her porch, pride warming her heart. Her people had faced their first real test and proved that the strongest defense isn't in weapons or walls, but in the connections between people, in the daily acts of living that become unbreakable when woven together with purpose and understanding. The sun was setting over the valley, painting the sky in colors of triumph, as Eleanor gathered her leaders for their evening meeting. Today had shown that everything they'd built, everything they'd taught, could withstand even direct pressure from territorial authorities. "You know what happens next," she told them, her voice carrying both pride and warning. "Harrison will try other tactics, send other men, but today proved what we've always known. Our strength isn't in what we can fight, but in what we've become. A community that protects itself by being more than any outsider can understand or break apart." Word of Shadow Creek Valley's encounter, with Shaw's men spread through the territory's communities like wildfire, carried by Martha's network of healers, Chen's traveling apprentices, and Sarah Martinez's web of hunters. Each telling added a new understanding of how a community could stand against corruption without raising a single weapon. Eleanor watched from her porch as another group of visitors arrived, these from a settlement 3 days' ride to the north. They came seeking not just protection, but understanding, having heard how Shadow Creek Valley had rendered Harrison's men powerless through nothing more than the coordinated patterns of daily life. "They're coming faster now," Rebecca observed, bringing Eleanor her morning coffee. The young woman's abilities as coordinator had grown even sharper since Shaw's visit. 3 groups yesterday, 2 more expected today, all wanting to learn our methods. "Good," Eleanor replied, seeing how her vision was spreading in ways even James might not have imagined. "Though remember what I taught you, we don't just teach them defense. We teach them how to weave protection into every aspect of community life." Inside the cabin, Martha was conducting what appeared to be a simple lesson in treating common ailments. But the women gathered around her were learning more than just medicine. They were learning how to organize healing networks that could serve as emergency communication systems, how to stock medical supplies that could support communities under pressure, and how to turn simple first aid stations into safe houses and coordination points. "The quilting circle sent word," Sarah Martinez reported, returning from her morning patrol. 2 more communities have adopted our pattern system. They're already using it to track Harrison's men's movements across the territory." Eleanor nodded in satisfaction. The territory's traditional quilting patterns had proved perfect for encoding information. A simple change in color or design could warn of approaching danger or signal that a community needed support, all hidden in plain sight as ordinary handicraft. "And Chen's apprentices?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. She had taught Rebecca to always verify information through multiple sources. "Spread faster than we expected," Rebecca confirmed. "Every tool they forge now serves at least two purposes. Even Harrison's own blacksmith sent his son to learn proper metalworking." "Techniques," her smile carried subtle triumph. The morning sun climbed higher over Shadow Creek Valley as Eleanor moved through her community, watching how naturally everyone had adapted to their roles in the larger pattern. Children's games now included subtle training in observation and coordination. Women's social gatherings doubled as strategic planning sessions. Men's work crews maintained perfect awareness of their surroundings while appearing to focus solely on their tasks. "Marshal Jenkins is here," Tom Wheeler announced, approaching with the lawman in tow. "Brings interesting news from Helena." Jenkins looked both amused and concerned as he joined them. Shaw's report to Harrison wasn't quite what he expected. He began accepting the coffee Martha brought him. "Seems our friend couldn't quite explain what he found here, or rather, what he didn't find." Eleanor's smile carried understanding. "Hard to write a report about something you can't quite grasp, isn't it? Especially when everything you're trying to describe looks perfectly innocent on paper." "Harrison's furious," Jenkins continued. "Started ranting about invisible networks and subversive domestic activities. Even claimed you've created some kind of territory-wide conspiracy disguised as ordinary community life." "Conspiracy?" Martha's laugh carried genuine amusement. "Is that what they're calling neighbors? Helping neighbors now? Perhaps we should invite the judge to our next preserving session. I'd love to teach him proper pickling techniques." The gathered leaders shared knowing smiles. They all understood the deeper meaning in Martha's words. Their preservation sessions had become one of their most effective means of spreading information and techniques throughout the territory's growing network of allied communities. "That's what makes this so powerful," Eleanor explained, not just to Jenkins, but to all gathered. "Harrison can't move against us without exposing himself. How does he explain to his superiors that he's targeting community gatherings, that he views social circles as threats, that he's afraid of quilting patterns and preserved vegetables?" Around them, Shadow Creek Valley continued its daily rhythm, each movement and activity part of a larger pattern that protected not just their community, but an ever-growing network of settlements learning to stand together against corruption and exploitation. "You've created something remarkable here," Jenkins observed, watching as Chen's forge rang with the sound of apprentices learning to make tools that served multiple purposes. "Something that spreads not through force or fear, but through the simple act of people helping people." Eleanor touched the serpent mark on her Remington, remembering how far she'd come from her days as silent Eleanor Reed. That's what James understood, what he died protecting. Real change doesn't come from defeating your enemies. It comes from building something they can't defeat. A commotion at the valley's entrance drew their attention. Another group of travelers had arrived, this time from a settlement near the territorial border. They came with news that Harrison's influence was spreading, that he'd begun pressuring communities in neighboring territories. "Good," Eleanor's response surprised those who didn't know her well. "Let him push. Every community he threatens becomes another link in our network. Every person he drives from their home carries our methods to new settlements." Rebecca, who had been coordinating the valley's response to the increasing flow of visitors, suddenly understood something deeper. "That's why you designed everything. To look so ordinary, isn't it? Not just to hide our defenses, but to make them easier to spread." Eleanor nodded, pride warming her voice. "Exactly. Anyone can learn to shoot a gun or build a wall, but teaching people to weave protection into the very fabric of their daily lives, that creates something that can't be broken or stopped. It grows naturally, like a garden tended by an entire community. The day progressed, full of what appeared to be normal activities, but were actually careful coordination and training. Women gathered at the well, sharing what seemed to be gossip, but was actually news from across the territory. Children played games that maintained perfect surveillance of every approach. Men worked at tasks that kept the community's defensive pattern flowing smoothly. "You know what fascinates me?" Jenkins mused, watching it all unfold. "Shaw's men spent an entire day here, searching every building, questioning everyone they could find, and they still couldn't quite explain what made them so uneasy. Couldn't quite put their finger on how an entire community could resist without seeming to resist at all." Eleanor's response carried the wisdom that had transformed her from a deadly operative into something far more powerful. That's because they were looking for something they could fight: weapons, guards, defensive positions. They couldn't understand that true strength isn't in what you can raise against your enemies. It's what you can build with your friends. As evening approached, more riders appeared on the horizon. Not threats this time, but representatives from other communities seeking to learn Shadow Creek Valley's methods. Eleanor watched them approach, seeing not just hope in their faces, but understanding. They had come seeking more than just protection. They had come looking for a new way of living, one that wove strength and support into every aspect of community life. "Each person who comes here," Eleanor told her gathered leaders, "carries our methods back to their own communities. Not just our defensive techniques, but our understanding that true protection comes from standing together, from turning ordinary activities into extraordinary strength." The sun was setting over Shadow Creek Valley, but something new was dawning across the territory. A network of communities that had learned to protect themselves, not through force of arms, but through the simple, unbreakable bonds of people helping people, teaching others, and standing together against those who would threaten their way of life. Judge Harrison's response to his growing powerlessness came as summer bloomed across the territory. Eleanor Matthews stood in her garden, now lush with herbs that served both healing and signaling purposes, when Sarah Martinez's warning network brought news that made even her experienced hand pause in its work. "Troops," the message passed through, their subtle channels. "Not just Harrison's hired men this time. He's convinced the territorial governor that our communities represent an organized threat. They're moving in force, with official backing." Rebecca, working beside Eleanor in the garden, noted the slight tension in her mentor's shoulders. "How many?" she asked, her hands continuing their careful work, even as her mind raced through the implications. 200 men, moving in coordinated groups, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying no fear, only calculation. "Harrison's learned from Shaw's failure. He's planning to hit multiple communities at once, trying to break our network before it can respond." The news spread through Shadow Creek Valley's now well-established communication system. Within hours, their entire network of allied communities was aware and preparing, but not in the way Harrison might have expected. "He's looking for resistance," Eleanor explained to her gathered leaders, "expecting us to fortify, to arm ourselves, to give him the confrontation he needs to justify his actions." Her smile carried decades of hard-won wisdom. "So we'll give him exactly the opposite." Martha's sewing circle expanded its activities, apparently working on summer clothes, but actually spreading detailed instructions throughout their network. Chen's forge buzzed with apprentices learning techniques that looked nothing like preparation for conflict. The children's games shifted subtly, maintaining perfect surveillance while appearing even more innocent than usual. "Word from Willow Creek," Tom Wheeler reported, returning from what appeared to be a simple trading trip. "They've already started," implementing the plan. When Harrison's men arrive, they'll find nothing but a harvest festival in progress, complete with games, food, and enough witnesses from neighboring settlements to make any aggressive action politically impossible. Eleanor nodded in satisfaction. And Pine Ridge? Wedding preparations, Rebecca confirmed, her coordinating skills having grown to encompass their entire network of communities. 3 families coincidentally chose this week to celebrate. Guests arriving from all over the territory, all completely legitimate, all perfectly documented. The summer sun climbed higher as Eleanor moved through her community, watching how naturally everyone adapted to this new challenge. The territorial troops would find no stockpiled weapons, no defensive positions, no organized resistance. Instead, they would encounter something far more powerful. Communities celebrating life together in ways that could not be disrupted without exposing the corruption behind the orders. "Marshal Jenkins is here," Sarah Martinez announced, leading the lawman toward Eleanor's porch. His expression carried both warning and admiration. "Harrison's serious this time," Jenkins began without preamble. "He's got official authorization to search every building, question every resident, break up any gathering larger than 10 people. He paused, studying Eleanor's calm face. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" "Of course," Eleanor replied, pouring his coffee with the same steady hands that had once made her the territory's deadliest operative. "Just like I know his men will find themselves trying to break up children's birthday parties, harvest celebrations, and wedding festivities. All perfectly legal, all heavily witnessed by visitors from across the territory." Jenkins couldn't help but smile. "And I suppose it's just a coincidence that every community in his path suddenly has something to celebrate." "Life is full of celebrations, Marshal," Martha joined them, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "Especially when communities stand together, support each other, share their joys and sorrows." The pattern she was working on, to trained eyes, contained detailed instructions for maintaining communication under increased scrutiny. The day progressed, each hour bringing news of Harrison's forces moving closer. But with each report came confirmation that their network's response was working perfectly. Communities that might have been vulnerable alone were now strengthened by the presence of dozens of legitimate visitors, all there for perfectly innocent celebrations. "You've turned his own tactics against him," Jenkins observed, watching as Shadow Creek Valley prepared for what appeared to be nothing more threatening than a summer social. "He can't move against ordinary people, celebrating together, without revealing his true motives." Eleanor's response carried the wisdom that had transformed her from a dealer of death into a protector of life. "That's what James understood, what he died teaching me. The strongest defense isn't in what you can fight, it's in what you can bring together." As evening approached, more riders arrived. Not refugees this time, but celebrants officially invited to Shadow Creek Valley's Summer Heritage Festival. Each one carried news, skills, and understanding that would strengthen their network, all hidden beneath the guise of normal community celebration. "Harrison's advance force is a day's ride out," Tom Wheeler reported during what appeared to be a casual conversation about festival preparations. "Shaw's with them. Seems he didn't learn his lesson the first time." Eleanor's smile carried no mockery, only understanding. "Oh, I think he learned more than Harrison knows. Notice how he's delayed their approach, given us plenty of warning time? Sometimes defeat teaches more valuable lessons than victory." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any. Upload from us!